You weren't born free, not imposed by brute force, but by patient repetition, not perceived as a prison, but accepted as reality. And that's exactly why it works. Mediocrity has not been imposed as punishment, but presented as an ideal. And whoever dares to question this ideal is quickly labeled, isolated, or silenced, not by tyrants, but by their own equals. Pay close attention. From an early age, thought is rewarded only when it doesn't threaten the collective equilibrium. Curiosity is permitted as long as it doesn't cross invisible boundaries. Machiavelli understood that the most efficient power is not that which compels, but that which guides. The average person doesn't feel oppressed because they believe they are choosing. But what kind of choice exists when all the options have been predetermined? Ultimately, the system doesn't need to prevent awakening. It merely makes it unnecessary. Machiavelli saw in this a subtle engineering, keeping the masses occupied with symbols of progress while remaining spiritually immobile. Work, consume, repeat, and to distrust any reflection that doesn't produce an immediate result. The man who thinks too much becomes unpredictable, and for any power structure, unpredictability is a greater threat than open rebellion. Machiavelli understood human psychology like few others. He knew that the most effective fear is not the fear of punishment, but the fear of exclusion. He relinquishes his own intuition, adjusts his words, softens his thoughts. Little by little, he no longer knows where his voice ends and where the collective echo begins. And then he sincerely believes that what he thinks is truly his own. But what if it isn't? What if many of your certainties are merely conditioned reflexes? This simple yet dangerous question is rarely asked, because it opens a fissure. Machiavelli knew that every transformation begins with an internal rupture, not with the world, but with narratives accepted without examination. Questioning is a solitary act, and solitude for an unprepared mind can be terrifying. There is an almost spiritual dimension to this process. It only keeps them dormant. Machiavelli never believed in the naivete of the masses, but neither did he underestimate their capacity for perception when confronted with stark truth. The problem is not a lack of intelligence. He has been trained not to access his strength, and this training is continuous, daily, almost ritualistic. Ask yourself, how many ideas have you abandoned in order to adapt? How many questions have you swallowed to avoid discomfort? How many times have you chosen the most accepted path, not out of conviction, but out of exhaustion? This is only the beginning of understanding. Before speaking of liberation, it is necessary to acknowledge captivity. Machiavelli wouldn't lead you by the hand, but would shine an uncomfortable light on you. And from that point, there is no easy return. What comes next demands courage, silence, and a rare disposition, that of not being ordinary. It doesn't happen in grand historical events or solemn speeches. The alarm rings not as an invitation, but as an order. He gets up without questioning, repeats inherited gestures, follows already trodden paths, not because he chose to, but because he learned that there is no worthy alternative outside this script. And the most unsettling thing, he feels pride in this obedience. In the streets, on public transport, in offices, and on screens, the same pattern repeats itself. People talk a lot, but say little. They opine on everything, but think almost nothing. They reproduce ready-made ideas with the conviction of those who believe themselves to be free. Machiavelli would understand this phenomenon as an absolute victory of invisible power. When control is perfect, there is no longer a need for surveillance. The individual watches over himself. He corrects his impulses before they even become words. He limits his own greatness so as not to stand out from the environment. Perhaps you've felt this before. That sudden urge to say something true, profound, or unsettling, followed by a calculated silence. That idea that arises in the middle of the night and is discarded in the morning for seeming too impractical. That ambition that dies before it's born because it doesn't fit the surrounding expectations. Machiavelli would see in these moments small internal deaths, not dramatic, not visible, but cumulative. Each one reduces the territory of the soul a little more. The modern system doesn't need to prohibit elevated thought. It merely makes it tiresome. The mind is kept occupied with artificial urgencies, constant distractions, and quick rewards. The individual reaches the end of the day too exhausted to reflect, and when he finally finds silence, he feels discomfort. The emptiness frightens him. Machiavelli would understand this fear as a clear symptom. Man has been distanced from himself for so long that he no longer recognizes his own presence. There is also the carefully cultivated fear of making mistakes. A man who fears the judgment of others will never dare to build something truly his own. He will live seeking approval, even when it requires betraying his own intuition. In everyday conversations, this conditioning is clearly revealed. Freedom is discussed, but always within safe limits. The system is criticized, but only to the extent that it doesn't demand real change. The individual accepts a predictable life in exchange for the illusion of security, and those in power accept this passivity as a guarantee of stability. There is a particularly revealing moment when someone breaks the pattern, not with violence, but with thought. An individual who refuses to repeat, who chooses silence instead of empty opinions, who acts outside expectations. What deviates from the norm exposes the artificiality of the norm, and that is intolerable for those who have built their identity upon it. At this point, an internal shift occurs. Some, upon perceiving this mechanism, retreat. They prefer the comfort of mediocrity to the solitude of lucidity, a sense that there is more, much more, beyond the repetitive surface of ordinary life. Machiavelli would consider this discomfort a rare sign, the beginning of an awakening that can no longer be ignored without psychological cost. Daily life then begins to change its appearance. The same scenes take on a different meaning. The same conversations sound empty. The same promises seem fragile, not for the system, but for the individual, because seeing is irreversible, and living consciously in a programmed environment requires strength, strategy, and an inner discipline that few are willing to develop. From here, the path narrows. Comfort diminishes. It is not enough to teach man to obey. It is necessary to teach him not to imagine. Over time, man stops asking, "What is possible?" and begins to ask only, "What is permitted?" This change seems small, but it redefines the entire mental structure. Dreams are adjusted to fit acceptable models. Bold ideas are discarded as naive. The future ceases to be an open field and becomes a predictable repetition of the past, because each individual becomes their own jailer. And then an uncomfortable question arises, one that almost no one allows themselves to ask. How many of your limitations are real, and how many were taught? Feeling too much is seen as weakness. Thinking too much is seen as a problem. Machiavelli observed that when deep emotions are discouraged, man becomes more predictable. He reacts, but does not create. He consumes, but does not transform. Gradually, the average man begins to distrust everything that requires introspection. Silence becomes uncomfortable. Loneliness becomes a threat. Any invitation to deep reflection is avoided as if it were a waste of time. Machiavelli would understand this as a perfect strategy, to distance the individual from himself so that he never discovers the extent of his own strength. Wouldn't this emptiness be a sign and not a mistake? It's not caused by rare books or hidden masters, but by a persistent feeling of incoherence. The answers seem too quick to be profound. Machiavelli knew that this unease is dangerous because it cannot be silenced with distraction for long. It demands an internal response. At this point, many try to backtrack. They try to convince themselves that they are exaggerating, that overthinking is useless, that everyone lives like this, and that's enough. Machiavelli would call this the system's last defense within the mind, a mechanism of psychic self-preservation, because accepting the truth requires taking responsibility, and responsibility is something that programmed man has been trained to avoid. One below-average questions too much, but the average maintains the balance. What if mediocrity wasn't just a social consequence, but a deliberate tool? What if being ordinary was the most expected role of all? When this idea takes hold, something definitively changes. The individual begins to observe the world with different eyes, no longer as an unconscious participant, but as a strategic observer. They perceive patterns, repetitions, circular discourses. On the contrary, it brings a burden, the awareness that escaping the average requires real sacrifices. It demands solitude, discipline, and above all, silence. Machiavelli valued silence not as the absence of sound, but as a space of gestation. It is in silence that the mind reorganizes itself outside of collective influence. How many prefer to face their own minds without distractions, without validation, without applause? From this point on, the path ceases to be theoretical. It's no longer about understanding how the system works, but about recognizing its reflection within oneself. Machiavelli knew that the greatest battle doesn't occur in external structures, but in the internal territory. The courage to stop being who they always said you were. There are curious records throughout history that rarely appear in mainstream textbooks, not because of a lack of importance, but because of discomfort. Machiavelli knew this kind of selective silence well. He knew that certain facts, when observed carefully, reveal more about the present than about the past. In periods of great social control, not only do visible tyrants emerge, but also crowds strangely content with small lives. This pattern has repeated itself in empires, republics, and democracies. The names change, the clothes change, but the essential behavior remains. A simple, almost banal example. They were solitary readers, attentive observers, people who had spent too much time in silence. They work longer hours, consume more stimuli, but reflect less. They weren't imprisoned nor formally punished. They were simply ignored, discredited, pushed to the margins. The result was almost always the same. Many returned adjusted, quieter, more like the others. In moments when systems have suddenly collapsed, many individuals have panicked not because of a loss of control, but because of a loss of direction. Without clear rules, without ready-made models, without symbolic authorities, they were paralyzed. Machiavelli would understand this phenomenon as the end result of programming. A man who has never learned to guide himself collapses when the path disappears. This is a crucial point. The individual learns to react, not to decide. They learn to follow flows, not to create them. Therefore, when something unexpected happens, the first reaction is not to think, but to seek instructions. Machiavelli knew that this dependence is the true triumph of invisible power. A dependent man can always be led. There are also personal accounts, almost universal. People who followed all the right steps, met all expectations, achieved stability and recognition, and yet felt an emptiness that was difficult to explain. Nothing visible was lacking, but something essential was missing. Machiavelli would interpret this emptiness not as individual failure, but as a sign of profound misalignment. The soul was not made to live only within safe molds. It demands expansion, calculated risk, internal confrontation. At certain times, ideas that seem obvious today were considered dangerous, not because they were false, but because they altered common perception. Machiavelli knew that power fears less lies than a change in perspective. Machiavelli saw this as a living organism, and so the average remained stable, comfortable, and profoundly limited. How many choices were made to avoid discomfort? How many paths were abandoned before even being explored? It brings a silent weight. The awareness that living below one's potential wasn't accidental, but a learned adaptation. Machiavelli would not offer consolation at this moment. He would offer clarity, and he would warn that this path is neither common, nor safe, nor widely approved. Machiavelli knew that this is the most dangerous moment of all, because there is no comfortable return. Up to this point, the individual has been able to reflect in silence, perceive patterns, feel the discomfort growing. But there comes a moment when continuing to live as before requires a greater effort than changing. The mind no longer accepts the old justifications. The body reacts. Something internal begins to resist the routine that once seemed normal. It is at this stage that many experience a strange feeling of disconnection. The same conversations sound repetitive. The same goals seem too small. What once brought pleasure now feels mechanical. Machiavelli would understand this discomfort as a clear sign of internal disruption. The programming begins to fail, and when it fails, the system reacts not from the outside, but from within the individual's own mind. Fear arises, not an external fear, but an inner one. Fear of losing identity, of losing one's place, of losing security. Fear of not knowing who one is without accepted labels. Machiavelli knew that this fear is the last line of defense of mediocrity. It whispers that it's too late to change, that thinking differently will not bring real benefits, that the risk is not worth it, and many believe it, not because it's true, but because it's comfortable. The more the individual tries to go back, the harder it becomes to ignore what has been seen. Attempts to distract oneself fail. Consumption does not fill the void. External validation loses its power. Something has been irreversibly broken. Machiavelli would say that this is the moment when man begins to become dangerous, not to others, but to the structures that depend on his predictability. At this point, a profound reversal occurs. Fear changes direction. It is no longer the fear of deviating from the norm, but the fear of remaining within it. The idea of living decades repeating empty patterns becomes more frightening than the uncertainty of the unknown. Machiavelli understood this shift as essential. Without it, there is no real transformation. Man only changes when the pain of continuing surpasses the pain of breaking free. The system then offers its final rewards: small comforts, refined distractions, promises of future recognition, all to keep the individual in line. Machiavelli would recognize this as a classic tactic. The awakener is not punished. Attempts are made to lull them back to sleep, and many accept. They readjust their desires, silence their questions, return to their expected role. On the outside, everything seems normal. Inside, something slowly fades away, but there are those who can no longer accept it, not out of heroism, but out of inner consistency. They realize that living in constant contradiction corrodes more than any external risk. Machiavelli saw in these individuals a rare strength, not the strength of noisy rebellion, but that of silent decision. They don't announce changes. They don't ask permission. They simply begin to act according to their own logic. This is the true rupture. It doesn't happen in public speeches, but in discreet choices, in what is accepted, what is refused, what is tolerated. The individual begins to observe before reacting, to speak less and think more, to carefully choose where to invest energy, time, and attention. Machiavelli deeply valued this phase because it marks the birth of real autonomy. There is tension here because nothing guarantees external success. There are no promises of recognition, wealth, or approval. What exists is something more subtle: internal alignment. The feeling that, for the first time, decisions are not being made to please, avoid, or imitate, but to uphold an invisible integrity. Machiavelli knew that few reach this point because it demands discipline without applause. The most unexpected thing is that by breaking with the internal norm, the world begins to react. People distance themselves without explanation. The environment becomes strange. The individual no longer fits in easily. This is not a coincidence. It's a consequence. Machiavelli would say that every true change alters the surrounding environment, and this alteration reveals who associated with you out of habit, not out of essence. Here, the viewer might notice something unsettling. There is no clear enemy to fight. There is no external villain to defeat. The battle has been, from the beginning, internal, against conditioning, learned fears, and imposed limits. And that is precisely why this fight is so demanding. There are no medals. There are no witnesses, only one's own conscience as judge. The final tension in this section lies in a question that begins to form, even without being spoken. If abandoning mediocrity is possible, what is the next step? What comes after the internal rupture? Machiavelli wouldn't answer immediately. He knew that certain answers can only be offered when the individual no longer seeks comfort, but truth. And that moment, silent and decisive, is about to arrive. Getting this far is already a sign that something within you has refused to remain dormant. Machiavelli would understand this as a rare turning point, not a mystical awakening, nor a dramatic break with the world, but a silent decision to no longer live on autopilot. He would say that true power begins when a man stops asking permission from the average and takes responsibility for what he becomes. The path from here requires neither extreme isolation nor rejection of the world, but discernment. Applying all that has been revealed begins with something simple and profoundly difficult: observing oneself without lies. Observing one's daily choices, one's emotional reactions, one's mental habits. Asking with brutal honesty whether each decision stems from one's own will or from the fear of being out of step. Machiavelli knew that clarity precedes any real transformation. The second step is strategic silence, reducing external noise not to escape the world, but to regain contact with one's own mind. Fewer outside opinions, fewer constant distractions, less need for validation. Silence, when sustained, reorganizes thought. It restores depth. It is in silence that intuition, previously stifled, speaks again. Machiavelli saw silence as an invisible weapon against collective manipulation. Next comes inner discipline. Not a rigid discipline imposed from the outside, but an intimate commitment to one's own lucidity, carefully choosing where to invest time, energy, and attention, rejecting what weakens, even when it is popular, enduring the discomfort of not fully belonging. Machiavelli would warn that those who seek autonomy must accept the momentary solitude it brings. But he would also affirm that this solitude is fertile, not empty. There is also discreet action. It's not necessary to announce changes or prove anything to anyone. True transformation reveals itself in the long-term and silent consistency. Small, repeated choices build an identity that doesn't depend on external approval. Machiavelli deeply valued this internal coherence because it makes the individual predictable only to themselves, never to the system. By applying these principles, something inevitable happens. The world ceases to seem absolute. Its rules reveal themselves to be flexible. Its pressures lose some of their power. You don't become invincible, but you become less manipulable. And this, for Machiavelli, was already a high form of freedom. Not the naive freedom to do everything, but the strategic freedom of not being unconsciously led. This is neither a quick nor a comfortable path. It demands constant vigilance over one's own thoughts. It requires courage to stand by unpopular decisions. It requires patience to see results that are not immediate. But Machiavelli would remind us that everything profound matures in due time. Haste is a tool of mediocrity. Clarity belongs to those who know how to wait. If something in this script resonated with you, don't ignore it. Discomfort is an invitation. Restlessness is a signal. You don't need to change everything at once, but you need to start somewhere. A questioned thought, an interrupted habit, a respected silence. Real transformation rarely begins in a grand way. It begins with an internal decision that no one sees. Now, this space is yours too. If you want, leave a comment about what made you reflect the most, even anonymously. Liking this video helps spread this message to those who haven't yet been able to name their own discomfort. And subscribing to the channel is a way to continue this journey, exploring ideas that don't conform to the average. Machiavelli would say that few choose to awaken, even fewer sustain the journey, but those who do never see the world the same way again. And perhaps deep down that's exactly what you were looking for.